Three, two, one, and welcome back to the SBH podcast. And in this podcast, we are going to be talking about patterning down bait fish during the summer for bigger striped bass. And it's a topic that really is very, very important during the summertime to really start going from that spring fishing to targeting those bigger, lazier summer bass that are not as willing to feed, and it takes a lot of persuasion to get those things going. And I've done a lot of thought about this myself just because of the fishing that I do, and it's very important in the fishing that I do to fish in this way. I really try to target those primary bait fish in the area that those bass are feeding on. I don't like going, and feeding on obscure bait fish and smaller bait fish. I try to target, or I try to mimic it rather, the biggest bait in the area and the most prevalent bait in the area. And for the whole season, and I mean the whole season, it's bunker for us, or Atlantic menhaden, pogies, whatever you want to call them. That is the number one bait fish for Cape Ann, pretty much all season long. You maybe have a little bit of herring in the spring, but even then we had the bunker in as soon as we had the herring in. And it's something that just targeting bait schools can be difficult for many reasons, just because number one, you don't always know what's in your area, and number two, it's so bait fish dependent, if it's most of the bait fish, and this is very general, but most of the bait fish feed on small enough bait that they get really pushed around by the wind, the bait that they feed on, or the food source that they feed on, and those bass in turn follow the bait. And I think that is a very important key, and really the number one pillar of what I base all of my fishing off of is following the wind. And I have people telling me that I shouldn't be doing that, but it's just never really failed me ever. If there's a good onshore wind, I don't care what direction the wind's blowing. If I have an onshore wind in a location, I feel much more confident that if it's a crosswind or an offshore wind. Crosswinds are not as bad, but if it's not if it's offshore at all, I'm not going to be as confident as it is if it's onshore. Now, that can all be, it really depends on the day, but most of the bait fish that I like to target, which is 99.9% of the time Atlantic menhaden, and they're filter feeders, and they'll feed on bait, or whatever they feed on, plankton and little particles in the water. That stuff is going to get blown around in the wind, and in turn, those Atlantic menhaden are going to get blown around in the wind, and those big bass are going to be on those Atlantic menhaden feeding on them, and therefore they're also going to get pushed around by the wind. Now, this doesn't mean that a bass can't stage up and start feeding on bait in specific spots no matter the wind, because that happens too. But for fishing off the rocks in particular, I really like to follow the wind, and it can get in. The thing about patterning down this is every single switch in the weather as well plays a huge factor into there being big bass or not. I've been fortunate enough to land some extraordinary bass so far this season, and if I didn't catch another big bass this season, I'd be happy with what I've got so far, and that is legitimate. Like, I got my over 30-pound bass, and I haven't talked about this yet. This happened between podcasts, so I should probably just go into that first. I landed a 34-pound bass. I didn't measure it, but it was a super long fish, so I'm gonna guess that it was at the low end of how long it was, it would have been about 45 inches, and at the high end, it probably would have been about maybe, this is again at the high end, would have been about 47. I think it was about, and so I'm going to guess about 46 inches. So it was a long bass, but it was a big fish. And I was fortunate enough to land that bass this season, and that for me was just like so big. That was so big that made me feel super happy to do it. We got it in extraordinary filming on it too, so stay tuned for the Striped Bass Hunt Show so you guys can actually see the whole hook up and fight of that fish, drag screaming, getting hit by big waves, swimming around with it, crazy release. I mean, that whole thing was amazing. I mean, I've gotten a good amount of larger bass this season, still pretty early in the season, but it hasn't been there hasn't been a lot of numbers. What I've got is more quality over quantity, and which I'm totally stoked by. Like, I'd rather get quality over quantity in general, just because who's not like, it makes it all worth it when you get those specific larger bass. And I've been doing something that I did last season, but now I'm a little bit better, more fine-tuned to that, and that is following bait really, really closely, and that is mimicking the bait, fishing where the bait's going to be when I know it's going to be there, and really playing the weather switches. And it's going to switch them on and off. The bite, it's going to keep switching it on and off and on and off and on and off. So this past moon phase, we had a cold front move in halfway through that. It shut the bite off, which is why I actually posted the picture of that fish so soon after that moon, was because I knew that once I posted that, even if people were fishing there in that area, they would not end up catching any bass there, in particularly. So it was not a big deal for me, because I knew that the bite was completely different after that. And it was, because I also fished all after that too, and I didn't get it, like, there's nothing going on after that. But leading up to that, we had huge high tides, crazy current, and there was big bait around, and there was huge bass around with it. And it's funny because there's been weird sizes of bass. You get a lot of those big class fish. You get those 40 plus inch bass. That's the class that's really in there. And then you get all those like mid high 20 inchers, and that's been a really big thing this season. And I feel like they're smaller last season, so it's a good sign you're seeing that class of fish growing. And we have a really healthy population this season, so that's such a promising sign to see bass like that and how healthy and happy they are, which is so good, and I'm really stoked on that. But and I've had a lot of fun in the estuaries as well. And so this time of the year is one of those things that you kind of have to fish the weather changes. And so when I'm not fishing the weather changes, I'm fishing estuaries, I'm fishing sandy beaches, getting on in those rips, fishing those spots where I know I can just start consistently catching bait. And that's what I've been just focusing on, is getting that consistent, capture of bait, or capture of bass through following the bait and the weather. And weather switches, I want to get a little bit more into what turns on a bite and what doesn't. And it can be as simple as rain. Rain can flip on a bite like that. And it's really funny because you can be fishing and there can be clouds around, but there won't be rain. And then it starts, like, you get a little like rainstorm move in, and then it'll be raining. And I kid you not, 2 seconds of it raining, the bass are fired up, they're pounding your topwaters. They're mostly small, but you can get those bigger bass that will start looking up for your plugs. I fish mostly topwater during the day, so you get those bass that turn on like really aggressively during that time period, and sometimes you can even squeak out a really solid bass. And I just have a lot of things going on in my mind, because there's a lot of stuff that I want to do, but I also just want to catch big fish. So I want to explore and I want to grow as best I can in different areas, but I also want to be able to still maintain consistent catching of large bass. And that's tough because I feel like I missed a bite early in the season. And so I'm going to have to kind of switch gears now. And that bite early in the season was an estuary bite that I figured out later in the season, which now for next spring, I'm going to be able to get on bass even earlier and even bigger. And it's not necessarily following herring, although herring is probably the bait they're feeding on. It's not necessarily blitzes on herring. It's just the biggest fish that are going to be moving in as early as possible in the spring. Those are the bass I want to be targeting, and I need to be targeting them in the estuaries. And I found some spots that just consistently hold bigger bass in the estuaries, and they have even into the really, really warm temps, and that gives me a lot of promise to think that, hey, there might be some decent size mixed in with that on those warmer spring nights. And what I've really found is that it's the shallow water. And the shallow water, when it goes, you get those deep drop-offs, it goes shallow water with rips. And that's what I've been really targeting, those rips and those little current pockets where it just kind of switches a little bit, or the currents bounce off each other and meet. And that's really where the bass have been, sitting in that area looking for those bait fish. And I've been doing very well on Topwater there. I've been just killing it in the estuaries. I'm getting like 50 fish days. I think the record so far is 83 fish in like a few hours of fishing in the estuaries. They're all mostly small. We got a few high 20s and one like 30-incher, but that's still, July in the estuaries. So that's pretty good. It's really warm, but hey, if I'm pulling bass like that on top, I'm not complaining at all. Fishing more soft plastics this year than I did last year. I hate fishing soft plastics, but they seem to just be culling those bigger bass when they're finicky. And I talked about it in the podcast when I talked about soft plastics. I talked about fishing them when the bass are being finicky and the bite is turned off. And it's really, really true. When the bite is turned off and their bass are being finicky, you throw big paddle tails or really any big sluggos, something like that, big hoagies. Like I don't like really care as far as the brand, but they all really catch bass. And I did so because there's one night in particular, I was fishing and it was pretty seaweedy, so I had an owner beast hook and I had it on two different soft plastics. One was like I had a forked tail. There's names for these soft plastics, but I don't fish them enough to even learn the names of them. And so one had a forked tail and it was like 8 inches, and the other one was an 8-inch sluggo, and or maybe more. They're huge. They're giant soft plastics, and I had a giant owner beast hook on it, and I'm fishing them, and I'm twitching, and it's seaweed, like bubbleweed, and I'm getting all of my darters and my shad swimmers and my glide baits all just getting gunked up, and I throw on these soft plastics and I just waylay 15 fish, all in the high 20s to 30 inches. And that's the thing, like you can just sometimes the bass are there, but you can't get them to commit to plugs because there's too much seaweed. And where that comes in, that's where I'm going to be throwing those soft plastics. And no, they're not like 40-pound bass, and no, they're not 30-pound bass, and no, they're not even 40-inch bass. But though, like if I'm still pulling 15 fish in the high 20s to 30 inches, I have no problem with that. That's a good night for me. And, it's even better when I can pull 15 bass that are over 40 inches. That's a great night, and I can only count those nights on one hand. So like that stuff happens, but it's generally not happening. It's been interesting because I had to adjust. I have spots that produced well for me last year that haven't this year, and spots that didn't produce anything for me last year and that are really producing this season. And that's very interesting to me. Why? So that was my big question. I was like, why are certain areas producing and certain areas not producing? And then it really came down to there being a concentration of bait in certain areas and not in others. And that concentration of bait makes the fishing extremely, extremely withering because the bass are there, they're just not very aggressive and not very hungry. And what you're trying to do is really pick that one or two sneaky fish that are not really paying attention. They straggle away from these bait schools and they're in the rocks trying to stage up. And then those are the bass you're trying to go after. And it's one of those things that's just a game of chance. You fish there, one night could be the perfect conditions and they won't be there, and the next night might not even be the perfect conditions and there'll be one big fish there. So it's been hours of fishing for that one monster, and that's really what it's been. It's just been quiet. And I'm talking about 4 hours of not even a touch, and then you'll get like a 30-pounder. So it's been interesting to fish like that. But back to really the bait fishes, we kind of have this smorgasbord of like bunker, you also have a mackerel being around, pretty prevalent right now as well, which I think there's less of, but they're still around. And then you have those sneaky baits, like there's been some flounder around, there's a lot of lobsters around. When you're waiting at night, you'll see them with your light as you're going out. And so there's some sneaky baits that I know are around that the bass are feeding on and that I just need to keep in mind. And so that's when you're like, okay, this area has some bigger baits, and you know that the bass are going to be trying to target and, figure out where these bigger baits are. And that's when you kind of can really start putting in work. And when you really start putting in work, oh man, I mean, it's so much fun when you can find that like area where you have your little honey hole and it's different from last season. You were working in the spot last season that was working and nothing was happening, and then it's like 30 yards to your right, you have fire. And that's what happened to me this season. I was working one area that was really producing for me last year, and I moved a little bit and then absolutely hammering them. And and I don't know why it's been like that, but it's just one of those things that I think that depending on the tides, depending on where the bass are, or depending on where the bait are, it's going to make the bass do some crazy things. And that's what I've been following. So I just wanted to share some of my tips on that, on what I like to do and throw, and to try to convince those finicky fish to actually start eating bait. And I actually did a podcast on how to catch finicky striped bass, excuse me. But it's good. Yeah, like if you want to listen to that, because it's going to be relevant now. This is probably the hardest time of the year to catch fish. I remember this was my biggest doldrum, and I've caught some big bass right now. So I feel really good because I feel like I'm redeeming myself from last year not catching as many big bass around now. But then it just heated up so, like, July, August, October is like absolute fire for bass, all the way up to 40, 50 pounds you're going to be getting. And hopefully I can break the 50 mark this season from the surf. I got really close last year with a 48 pounder, so we'll see. It's just, if the bait is the way it is and it stays the way it is, which it's gonna stay. I can't imagine something crazy would have to happen to push the bait away or move them. I can see some nutty things happening in the fall, so I'm pretty excited for that. But really, right now, we got to focus on that summer, grind sesh, and we just got to believe in eels. In eels, we have to believe, because they are going to catch your big fish this time of year. If you're not throwing an eel, you're not going to catch a big fish. And I'm like, yeah, you can catch a big fish in a plug every once in a while, but I mean, realistically, if you want to get those finicky bass, which they are right now because the water temps are warmer, so they're not as willing to eat, you need to be throwing eels. And that's what I've been doing pretty much exclusively, is throwing eels. Yeah, I'm breaking out the plugs during the day and fishing those, but if I really am grinding for some big fish and I want to catch some larger bass, I'm pulling out the eels. And it's not been a gong show type like season. I haven't gotten on a bite where I'm catching multiple bass over 30 pounds, or like even more over 30, even over 35 inches. It's not been like that. It's been slow. It's been hours upon hours of nothing for that one eat, or that one hit. And it's super scary because you have a bunch of 30-inch bass around and you get these pecks on your eel. And with these new circle hook regulations, you're like, how much do I give this bass? And it's just, oh, by the way, circle hooks are out the window. I said this in the last podcast, but they don't work at all. You're going to get the same amount of gut hooks. I don't care what you're saying. I've literally fished. I was fishing on a lineup and I saw 4 guys gut hook fish, 4 on eels. And like, this is ridiculous. I didn't even see that many people gut hook them with J hooks, because normally when people are fishing with J hooks with eels, they're going to be sitting there cranking away and they're going to get taps and hook into the fish. Now they're like, how long do I feed this? And then they get swallowed, and then you're gut hook fish. So I think they're out the window personally. Whoever made that regulation is probably not a fisherman. Because unless you're fishing in a boat, okay, I gotta backtrack, I guess, a little bit. If you're fishing with like bunker, that probably that might work, which I guess is probably what the majority of people are doing. But if you're fishing with an eel, like, eels are small enough that like a bass is not gonna have trouble swallowing them fully. And if they're big enough, they're just gonna instantly into their stomach. And so that's when you feel that instant tap, boom, you're hooking into them with a J hook. But now it's a little different. You got to give them that, oh, you feel that tap, you gotta wait, bang. And I've not been reeling in. I'm hook setting into mine. And I've lost some that felt huge. Like, you feel that tap, and it's not like that, oh, it's like a little tap from a fish. It's like that sharp, like, on the top of your rod, and you're like, ooh. And then you like give it a little bit, and then you hook into it and it pulls out of its mouth, and you're like, oh no, that could have been big. So who knows how many giant fish that I've not caught this season. And you're kicking yourself, because you're sitting out there and you're fishing and you spend 4 hours fishing, and the night before you catch a 30 pounder. And this night, same kind of deal. You're fishing 3 hours in, not a touch. You get that one sharp punch on your eel, and you just don't, like, you're giving it a little bit, and then you're like, okay, I'm gonna reel into him, and then it comes out of its mouth, and you're like, oh. Same deal last time, except it was a 32 pounder. So was that a 32 pounder or was that a 30 incher? It's just so hard to tell. And I've just been trying to make myself feel better and say all the bass that I've not hooked into are 30-inch bass, but I could probably guarantee you that some of them were in those like high 40s that I'm just missing, just not getting into. But yeah, it gets me, it just gets me going, because it's tough, because you really want to follow the regs, and it's tough, man, because the biggest part of my fishing is eeling, really. If I'm going to be honest, I'm going to catch if not all of my big fish until fall on eels. And then when fall comes around, it doesn't matter. You can throw a hot stove in there and some nights, and they'll be eating it. And that's the thing. Like, there's nights that, I kid you not, it was every cast 40-inch bass on plugs, but that's 1 out of 100 nights you're fishing. That's one day, and that's what happened last year. But and there's a few other nights that were really spicy, but the bass were just, it's a whole thing. And now I don't know, like, seasons are different. Am I gonna get those shots at them? So I've been like, it's been messing with my head. So I'm gonna try to go eel skinned plugs. Because I'm gonna be doing a lot of eeling next week, because I have that week off. So I'm gonna just eel that whole week pretty much, and then if the eels die and if they're big enough, I'm putting them over needlefish, I'm putting them over metal lip swimmers, I'm putting them over like darters, I'm putting them over anything that I can. And yeah, we'll see what happens. I'm kind of actually excited. I've heard so many good things about eel skin plugs, and I think that might be the way to go this season. Okay, I gotta also say this, rig deals too, I've been killing the game with as well, but I don't use them as much. So here's the thing, when the tides are so ridiculously strong and powerful and the waves are big, it's tough to throw a rig deal, because the rig deal is gonna be right on the surface there, and when you have a live one, you can cast it out there and it will swim down enough that it's like down, and that's when it's going to get pounded. Because the 30 pounder I caught, I was fishing a eel, it was losing its life slowly, it was getting less lively as I'm fishing it, and it get less lively, and then I switched to a new eel, like second cast I think I hooked the 30 pounder. So it was like right after I switched eels, and the thing was swimming down a little bit more, and you had these huge tides and this crazy current, and the eel just swims right down in front of the bass's face, and it's gonna punch it, versus it having to go way up into the top section of the water where there's this crazy waves and splashing, and it's just like, I don't want to deal with that. So especially when they're being finicky summer bass. And that's where you get those eels that swim down in there. And I was using huge eels. I was using like a 20-inch eel to start, and I didn't hook anything on that. And then I switched to like a 14-inch eel. So it was like a nice size one. It's like that big, and it was big enough that like it was still like pretty powerful, but it wasn't huge. It wasn't like that big and like that thick around and like craziness. And so I was throwing that. And it went swim down, and then boom, and then just like it hits it hard, and then you're like leaning on for dear life. Yeah, and the footage of that, you literally see me, I'm leaning back like all the way into this fish. I'm leaning all the way back, the rod's like bent out, and I'm just like leaning all the way back into it. It's peeling. I mean, that was I just can't wait until you guys see this stuff. The first episode, we just finished it. It's rendering out as I am speaking right now. The second, or I guess it's not the second, but it's the first episode with the sponsors, which you'll, I guess, see when it drops. Then I'll talk more about them afterwards, but on the podcast and stuff. And again, dream come true. And yeah, so you'll be able to see who ended up sponsoring the show, and when this episode comes out. Really, the first sponsored episode, the first real episode. The first was the pilot. Second episode's the second episode. And we got into a good fish, and we leave you on a cliffhanger. So yeah, it's gonna be yeah, that's a little tease for you guys that are listening to the podcast. You guys get the inside scoop, the little bit of a tease to what's actually to come. And yeah, if you're not, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, because there's some like the best fishing, like striped bass fishing, surf casting, period. There's no better video out there by miles. We've blown every single other surf casting videos out of the water by miles with this one, and I can say that with supreme confidence. And the next one's going to be even better. So, and then the next two are like ridiculously good. So it's like you can't even make this stuff up, how good this stuff is. It's really it's such a trip, because there's just, I mean, I'm so excited. I'm like, I see this stuff over and over and over again, and I never get bored of it, because we're editing this for 10 hours a day, you know, crazy hours editing, crazy hours doing like filming and fishing, and it's so awesome. It's just so awesome. But we're having a blast this summer. This summer's been so awesome, and the fishing's been very, very good, and I'm staying fresh, you know, on the bites here, trying my best to stay fresh on the bites while I'm doing all this other stuff. So yeah, and I feel like it's been very weird, because it has, and I've said that. I feel like I keep saying it, but it's been weird. Not that last year was ever any like normal. It was actually tough last year. This season's a lot easier for a lot of guys, and including me. It's been a lot easier, but I think it's been more easy for boat guys than it has been for shore. Shore fishermen have been really getting the butt end of the stick on this one, really, because the bigger bass are definitely on the bunker schools, and that's a fact. You get those like once in a while, you get those guys that will swim off those big bunker schools and into the rocks, and that's when we're gonna have a shot at them, or into the river mouths or onto the sandy beaches. But they're few and far between and very difficult to track down. So if you're in a boat right now, you guys are absolutely destroying them. If you are in a boat and you're not snag and dropping bunker right now, I don't know what you're doing, because you're pretty much having, like, you have a better shot than I will all season at a 50-pound bass snag and dropping bunker right now, or all around Cape Ann. And the guys doing it, they're not even that far out. I'll give you a hint. Go like almost all the harbors, just outside the harbors of almost all the harbors, have been loaded with bunker, and the guys in the boats are going out there snagging them and dropping them down just like 2 miles out of the harbors, and they're killing them. You know, I don't care if you're in Boston or, I don't know, Salem. That's where it is. That's where it's at right now. Yeah, so that's what you should be doing. And the guys from shore, I mean, it's tough because you can't really fish around those harbors. That's not really where it's at. And then the rocks, like off of the rocks, you really got to find those perfect structure points where the bass are, that like it's the best structure for the fish to stage. And that's the only thing that's been really really producing anything of any size. I also put a question on my Instagram, and on my Instagram story, and I asked questions about summer fishing. So I don't know exactly how long we've been going for right now, but I can check. We started around 5:30, and it is 6:01. So I guess we should just give her a look and see what we got here. If we got any questions to start us off, or anything that I can kind of go in more depth with. I'd laugh if we don't. Oh, we got a bunch. Okay, sick. Okay, here we go. Let me just pull this up. My phone's being really slow. Wi-Fi is not happening right now. Okay. What water column do you most of the time plug? Whoa, okay, sorry. That was my bad. What water column do you most of the plugs you throw in the summer time at night and day? What are the, okay, sorry again. I'm reading, it's like on a small screen, so, my bad. So let me just read and then relay to you guys, so because I'm blind. Okay, so this reads, what water column do most of your plugs, the plugs that you throw, swim at night and day? So this is a really good question. Thank you for asking me this. So during the day, as I kind of said earlier in this podcast, I fish 99.99% of the time on the surface, and then other 1% I'm fishing just under the surface. And I really like throwing big spooks during the day. It's not big spook, but I like to throw really big spooks during the summer. You get up early in the morning. I'm talking 2, 3 in the morning. You get out there right as the sun kisses the surface of the water, and you throw the biggest spook, preferably the Puma Plug Magnum Walker, and you take that thing out. You go to your good rock spot. If it's a little foggy, all the better. And you throw that thing, and that is your best shot at getting one of the biggest bass you can get during the day, the whole year, pretty much. That's where it's at. I don't care if you're in a river mouth. I don't care if you're off the rocks. I don't care if you're in shallow back bay waters. If you're gonna get a big bass, it's gonna be on a big spook during the day. That's what I'm doing. Big spooks. If it's really crazy nasty out and like middle of the day, like northeast wind, like big storm, I'm gonna throw a giant Puma pencil, the biggest Puma pencil model, and I'm gonna throw it in bunker. And that thing absolutely tears the water surface up. It's easy to work, and yeah, I mean that thing. If you're gonna get at the attention of a big bass during the day, that's what I've been throwing. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, but not only that, that's daytime, right? So mostly on top, and then I guess if we go subsurface, what are we gonna go with? Because I'm fishing pretty much at the surface during the day, but I don't really fish that much during the day. I've been fishing in the back bays and estuaries, a lot of like algag whippets and sluggos, and just on like little owner beast hooks that are just going, I don't know, a foot, 2 feet below the surface. And I guess the algags are kind of bottom bouncing a little bit, but not much. And that's really what's been putting in work during the day during the summer. But again, spooks have been working even during the middle of the day, little pencils. Yeah, it's been all of that type of stuff. Yeah, I mean, and then if we're gonna go into like nighttime fishing is a whole new game. So I've been doing some like what I would like to call like really extreme surf casting. Like, I mean, also, by the way, thanks everyone that gave me recommendations on wetsuits, because I asked that. I ended up just getting like what is it called? Wow, I'm blanking on the name, but I got just like a normal, it was an O'Neill, just back zip wetsuit. It was just, it's something just to be able to not have to wear my waders at night. But it was really windy one night, the night after I got it, and I took it out and I was plugging, and it was really windy, really choppy, and I was fishing darters and bottleneck swimmers and shad swimmers and all that good stuff. So I was really fishing like with the bottlenecks and the darters, a foot, 2 feet under the surface of the water, but I'm fishing probably 8 to maybe 10 feet of water at the deepest. But the shallower sections are like maybe 5 feet deep. So I'm not fishing that deep, but I'm in big boulder fields. I'm just gonna set this down so it's not really, I'm not messing with it. Okay, but I'm fishing like in boulder fields, so I was just fishing under the surface, and I was getting a lot of just nice fish, and I was fishing just under the surface there. And then I'm fishing rigged eels, so I've been fishing a lot just like, in rigged eels you can really fish any, like a good amount of different water depths, but I've been fishing again that just 2 feet under the surface. But as I was saying, during the full moon, it was really, really extraordinarily big, like waves and current and tide swings and all this nice stuff. And so I was fishing eels, and I was trying to get them down as deep as possible. I was also fishing like bucktails and stuff and trying to get them down as deep as possible, trying to fish, a few feet off the bottom, because that's where I thought those bigger fish would be. And sure enough, the biggest bass out of the whole moon phase I got was really close to the bottom. Like the eel was in a rock, pulled it out of a rock, took a few cranks, bam, I got slammed. So like that's what it was. And that was probably 20 feet deep. on that fish. And it was a nice eel, and I let him swim down there. So yeah, I'm fishing pretty much the whole water column, but it really depends on the night. That's very important. It's the swing at night. And during the day, what you really want to do is you want to fish from top to bottom or from bottom to top. But if you can pick, I'm gonna fish kind of middle to start, and then I'm gonna either work either way depending on confidence in plugs. So like if I'm fishing a darter that's diving 2 feet under the surface, and then I want to get down a little bit deeper, I'm going to go with a shad swimmer. I'm going to rip it a few times, and that lip on the front of it is going to dive it down really deep, and I can get that thing 6-8 feet deep if I want to, and that's down near the bottom. I can bend the eye of the metal lip down or up, and I can get it dive even deeper if I want it to, and get it right down in those rocks, bouncing off those rocks there if I really want to, and that's been really producing that better bite. Okay, let's get this next question up and rolling. Thanks for that. That was a really good question. Okay, best water temp. Favorite water temp to fish. I was actually talking to a guy and he nailed it perfectly on the head. I don't think he's listening to this podcast, but favorite water temp to fish during the whole year really is 68 degrees. If you can get that 68 degree water temp, you're absolutely minty. And we're in the conversation, we're saying like that's where the bass can digest the easiest. That's where they're growing the fastest. That's like the water temp that you really, really want to be fishing at. And that's the water temp that I try to gauge off of. I also like going for water clarity as well. If the water's super dirty, doesn't tend to be as good. And dirty meaning like silty. If it's seaweedy, it can still be really productive, but the water clarity is the most important. It needs to be super clear, in my opinion, during the summer. Because water, if it has a lot of particles in the water, it's gonna, I think it traps a little bit more heat, so it makes it a little warmer water. The clearer the water, the quicker the temperature kind of can fluctuate through it. What are the best beaches on the Cape for stripers? I'm assuming this person's probably read my bio and it says Cape and Surfcaster, and he probably read it wrong. I can't really answer this with, I know Nauset's a really good fishing beach, but I've never fished there. Yeah, if you're on the Cape, go to the canal right now. It's freaking lit up. If you've been on Instagram, you would know. Anyway, okay. Okay, what hooks do I use when fishing live eels? I've been using a bunch of different ones. Right now, I've been using like Owner circle hooks, just like size 8 Owner circle hooks right now. And those are the ones I'm using at the second. I might change depending on if I find problems with it. But I haven't experimented enough to really talk with enough confidence to back up any of these hooks. I used to use Gamakatsu octopus hooks for eeling, but now this is like I can't talk about those because they're illegal unless you're fishing for bluefish. What are the best lures for big striped bass? Best lures for big striped bass, we're gonna go all surfaces, right? Okay, ready? Spook. So Magnum Walker, if I had to pick 3 like best lures during the day, Spook, Magnum Walker, that's it. End of story for that one. I guess you could maybe throw a Danny, or yeah, like a big Danny plug. You could probably throw that, and that would do really well as well. And then darters are really, really productive. I don't fish a lot of needlefish, so I'm not gonna go into that. And then like a bucktail probably. But it really depends. But those will cover your 3 depths, and if you want to really get the biggest bass, that's what I'm going to go with. But I do like big metal lips that you can bottom bounce with, like Danny plugs that dive, like deep diving Danny plugs. That kills too. So those plugs are like, if I'm going for like some really big bass, that's what I'm going for. Top 3 plugs for back bay stripers. Top 3 plugs for back bay stripers. Ooh, that's a really good one. Walker, so that's a Walker, Magnum Walker, or not Magnum Walker, just like a Walker, just the plain Walker. Algag whippet fish, and And then if you're gonna go with a smaller spook, because really spooks are really good, or even a small pencil would be good. But I also like the Rebel jumping minnows. Those are really saucy in the back bays too. But if you want big bass, then I'd go with like the Walker, just because it's a little bit bigger, but it's still a spook and it has that super seductive action on the surface. And when you're fishing the back bays, the water is not super deep, so the bass tend to be very willing to go pound the surface, no matter if it's during the middle of the day or not. Since it has been heating up, how will this affect the shore fishing? As I've been talking about a good amount this podcast, shore fishing is going to get tougher and more finicky. But if you do those things that I've been really talking about this podcast, which is just really just trying to, it's tough because if I had to say how's it going to affect the shore fishing in general, it's going to shut down bites. So what I mean by that is you're going to have a much harder time to get on multiple large bass in a row. It's not going to be impossible, but it's going to get harder. What the good thing is that it makes bass big. Like you can get the biggest bass right around now, or not the biggest, but you can get big bass right around now. So just, grind it out. It's going to be a grind. You're going to have to put in hours upon hours, but if you're in a good spot and the bass are moving through, every once in a while you get that over 40-inch bass to push through that area and you'll have a shot at it. Mornings are always the best really during the day, because evenings are a little bit hot. So early mornings are really good. Yeah. And that's really like, I feel like that's as far as we've been going here, is the kind of the recap or my closing thoughts on this is when we're talking, I went into this podcast talking about something that I think is one of the biggest, the biggest thing that affects the bite, how the fish are feeding. And the one thing that you can't depend on, but if it's in your area, you can rely on it, is bait. You can really kind of rely on big bass being around big bass baits like adult bunker, mackerel, flounder, lobsters, but then it gets squid. You can do there's so much different bait fish that bigger bass will eat, but you can just go down the line. But really, I'm talking adult bunker because that's what I deal with most of the time, and I can't rely on there being adult bunker around always, but I can say with good confidence that that if I really want to catch a big fish, if I can find adult bunker, I can rely on the fact that bass need to eat those adult bunker to be big, and that there should be big bass around those adult bunker. Now they could be in very small quantities, but there should at least be some big bass around them. So if I had to really leave you with something, I'm going to leave you with that in particular. You can't rely, or you can't depend on bait for producing big fish, but they're in your area and you know what they are, you can rely on big bass feeding on those fish. And that's really the big takeaway from this. And really try to find the cool, clean water. That's another big one. The 68 degree temps, if you can get to that, are very productive temps. And that's the thing, it's one of those things that 60 degrees, what I have to say is you can tend to find bass in the 40-inch size around 60 degrees. They tend to be pretty bitey in that 65, to 6 to 70. That they're a little bit bitey, but once it goes to 70 and above, then they're tough. So 68 is kind of in the middle there, and that's where it's kind of minty. That's my preferred thing. I don't focus too much on water temps as far as you can catch bass when it's super warm. I'm in the estuaries and the water's easy in the 70 degrees. And I've been getting bass into 30 inches very consistently on Topwater. And I've had, as I said, I had 80 fish days on Topwater lures with decent sized fish, fun fish with light tackle. I'm talking about the lightest Lamaglass carp and surf rod and, small reels. I'm fishing 30-pound braid to 30 liter, small TA clips, little spooks, little algag whippets, like all that type of stuff in the estuaries this time of year have been productive. But again, that's really warm, and then you can go, the colder temps are obviously not going to be on the sand. Like, you get in between, you get the warmest temps are going to be in the estuaries, then you're going to get those little bit cooler temps off of the sandy beaches, and then you're going to get the coolest water probably off the rocks, I would say, just because I think that it's deeper off the rocks, obviously, in Cape Ann. And really, if you're anywhere you're fishing, most places on the Striper coast are going to have sand beaches and estuaries. So fish the sand beaches this time of year, and try to stay away from the estuaries. Or if you are in the estuaries, and there are fish in the estuaries this time of year. They're not going to be giants, but they're going to be around. Try to fish those transitions from really deep to shallower water, and try to fish those cooler areas of those, like rivers. And rivers are going to be also, I'm kind of generalizing rivers and estuaries in one bubble right now, because they are pretty much one bubble. But yeah. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. And I hope you enjoyed it. Again, check out the YouTube channel, because July 18th, the second episode of the Striped Bass Hunt Show drops, and I'll see you next time.